Welcome, everybody, and hello. Yeah, welcome, everybody, and hello. Welcome to the inaugural program, virtual program of the Houston Cinema Arts Society. And we're so happy that you've joined us. This program is in partnership with the HAAPI Film Festival and the Age Society Texas Center. And we're so excited to have these two incredible organizations be our partner on our first virtual film program of 2020. And just want to again, say hello to everybody and say that everybody at the Houston Cinema Arts Society, everybody at the HAAPI Film Festival, and the Age Society Texas Center really hopes that you are all, staying safe and well and okay. And yeah, and we're going to get this under these incredible circumstances. We hope everybody's doing all right and is okay. And we're going to get this program going. So today we are really excited to be presenting this program. And this is following the end of a virtual theatrical run of Wild Goose Lake. And we're going to be in conversation. Oh, and I am Jessica Green. I am the artistic director of the Houston Cinema Arts Society. Hello. Hi, everybody. And we're going to be in conversation today with the incredible Karen Fang, who is also a board member of the Houston Cinema Arts Society. She is a renowned film scholar, and she is a writer, and she is the author of Arresting Cinema, Surveillance in Hong Kong Film. And she is a juror on many film programs. She's part of the Museum of Fine Arts Film Committee in Houston. She teaches at the University of Houston. And she is working on an upcoming book about Bambi artist and Disney legend, Tyrese Wong. So yeah, we're really excited to have Karen with us to talk about this film and bring her expertise to the table. And yeah, so I'm gonna just get right into it. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna ask Karen a few questions about Wild Goose Lake, and then we're gonna take some questions from y'all, from the audience. So yeah, get your questions ready about the film, get your questions ready for Karen. And yeah, so the first one I wanna start with for Karen is, hi, Karen. And I want to ask you about this film as a film noir film. I might even call it a neo-neon noir film. If you could speak a little bit about its film noir bona fides, and also like how the tradition of Chinese film noir, how it falls into an international film noir tradition, how it falls into a Chinese film noir tradition, and just, share with us a little bit about that and tell us about that.
Yeah, so, the director, Dao Yinan, he actually was a very sort of cerebral and a thoughtful filmmaker, and he studied screenwriting, and he is very self-conscious in his references, both within Chinese cinema and also in world cinema. And so, there's a lot of global critics that sort of recognize a lot of references in Wild Goose Lake to a lot of sort of French and American cinema, like the references to Hitchcock's Strangers on the Train towards the very end, where you have this sort of background of the denouement happening in front of a noodle stand, and sort of like certain graphic moments of violence, shall we say, that happen as various moments, sort of the importance of water, both rain, like climate, and then being like things happening around water. If you go back to these very famous essays about noir that were written back in the 40s and 50s, talk about the importance of sort of water scenes in American and French noir. It's very self-conscious for the filmmaker, and so obvious in the film Wild Goose Lake. And I feel like that's the sort of world cinema noir is more obvious and more deliberate and self-conscious, because in a way noir as a genre didn't really exist in mainland Chinese film for a long time. There were a lot of reasons why that, largely because of sort of regulations about what was appropriate, what kinds of films could be made under the state system. Now, because Chinese language film now is so is multinational now, right? Where, I mean, just the actors alone in Wild Goose Lake draw from Taiwan, and filmmakers, actors, and technicians who have worked in Hong Kong as well. So, and of course, Chinese language film now just is much more global in a way than it has been before. So I think Diao Yinan is sort of working in dialogue with sort of contemporary crime cinema by contemporary Chinese filmmakers, both within mainland China, like Jia Zhangke or Bi Gan, but also with Hong Kong filmmakers who, of course, are very renowned for their sort of regional or idiosyncratic engagement with the noir genre as well. And so there's a sort of multi-referential kind of noir that's happening that Diao Yinan is working with, that is both sort of global, I would say, and Chinese and contemporary Chinese as well.
And like, what do you think about, noir at this moment in Chinese contemporary cinema? Like, noir tends to emerge in certain cultures and societies as a particular historical moments that are sort of commenting and working through what's going on, what's happening, perhaps like in a really healthy way, and often working through themes of governmental corruption, kind of bleakness, but then kind of glimmers of hope within that, as we see in this movie, and sort of the ending and the two women walking off into the sunset, so to speak. Can you speak a little bit about that in terms of why noir is emerging, at this particular moment in Chinese cinema right now?
Yeah. I mean, there's always this question of like how intentional and self-conscious, artistic production is, right? But of course, what we know historically about noir, right, is, as you were just saying, it emerges at these moments of sort of noir represents the sort of underbelly or the cynicism or the disillusionment that might inhabit that always lies beneath the surface, right? So in America and Hollywood, the sort of post-war environment, there's a kind of dystopia that's underneath, that's still dealing with the repercussions of war, even like as the country seems to be moving towards prosperity. And that was recognized by the French critics during the 60s. And so it would make sense, right, that China at this moment of sort of like, decades now of a turbocharged economy where many people are becoming more wealthy and enjoying more freedoms, and certainly a kind of lifestyle that had been unimaginable 20 or 30 years ago, but it also comes at a price of a certain kind of freedom as well, right? And then so that would make sense, that noir as a genre, as a film language, as an idiom, allows artists, filmmakers, right, to articulate that sensibility, that cynicism, that unsettled feeling that inhabits, right, this kind of moment of apparent prosperity, but a suspicion about that kind of lifestyle. And of course, Wild Goose Lake, as we know, is set a very particular moment in Chinese history, even though it's not an important part of the plot. The temporal grounding of the film is something that's given as a sort of clue in the film.
Right. And it's set in Wuhan.
Yes.
Also. And there is the characters are speaking a Wuhan dialect, correct, in the film, and it really leans into this idea of Wuhan being surrounded by these lakes, right, and that are almost kind of mysterious, in the film in ways. And and in terms of the particular time, it is set in 2012, right, and is based on this actual real life case, right, of a thief, right, in Wuhan that killed a cop, and then was under chase for that, and had a wife or a girlfriend who was epileptic, right, as well. So there's, that's interesting. And then I guess 2012 is the year the head of China came into power. So these kind of oblique references, and it is rooted in this real event. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, and then also how this connects up to you're an expert on kind of the surveillance state, right? And in Hong Kong film, but there's a parallel here, with this story. And I mean, he's really, kind of being chased throughout, and there's the scene where everybody's like watching, him on the news, and he's, like it's almost as if the entire city is looking for him. And there really is that kind of theme of the surveillance state in this film. And if you could speak a little bit about that in kind of Chinese cinema, Hong Kong cinema, and then, yeah, like this moment we're living in, right? This kind of broad global surveillance state moment that we're all in. We're on Zoom right now. Hey, everybody. So yeah, yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the things that makes Wild Goose Lake such a wonderful film at this important moment, and also again a sort of instance of like those moments when artists sort of catch lightning on a bottle and like achieve something maybe even more than that they understood at the time that they were making it. So Dowie Nan always says that he's a screenwriter. He develops the stories with these sort of gems of like stories that he holds on to, things that he imagines. So, little bits of little anecdotes that he finds or images that he brings up, and he sutures them together. He holds them until he feels like they come together. And so there had been this case, as you described, of a cop killing that happened several years before 2012. And he'd also said that he had this image of like the train arriving and a couple, and I believe there's also the case I'm not sure if that killer, the cop killer, was the one who hid in a zoo, but he had also retained something. He remembered something about a case where somebody hid in a zoo, and he wanted to use that.
And something happened in 2012. Like there's some case, like there's
Right. So he has all of these things that he just as a screenwriter, he's holding on to, sort of gelling in his brain, and he eventually starts to put them together into this film. And and if you think, and of course this is long before Wuhan, which has become sort of ground zero for the pandemic crisis, the global pandemic that we're living in right now, which is why we're on Zoom, and we can talk about that in a moment. But I think if you don't even know any of this stuff when you're watching the film, what you get in that film is very early on, you get a scene of somebody passing by a street light and putting a piece, like an old rag, on a long, very long pole, and reaching up to try and hang the rag over the surveillance camera. And it's a moment that it points out to what a lot of people don't know about China, is China is an incredibly surveilled state. Like, we all in the West, we hear these notions about China being an authoritarian country, right, where the state has absolute power, and we have these notions of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, being able to go anywhere with tanks. But actually, surveillance actually happens on a much more atomized level, where it affects everybody on a very personal basis. And so, it's the surveillance cameras that person is trying to cover up with the rag. It's also through the neighborhood committees that have been in place since the Cultural Revolution, where neighborhood citizens are encouraged to inform upon each other. So there's always a sort of neighborhood committee that knows what's going on, and that works very closely with the Gonganbu, which is like the local police. And that's what most people in China experience, not the PLA, but the local police. And there's always a scene in Dowie Nan's films where you get to go inside the local police station, and what you always see is actually kind of run down. It doesn't even look very official. Nobody's wearing a uniform, and it really gives you a sense of like simultaneously how sort of like ragged the state police system is, but also how pervasive it is, because there's no separation between domestic life and the police. They're one and the same thing in China. And so what Dowie Nan shows very realistically is, as how this kind of state surveillance has become a recognized fact of life in China, which now is much more technical as well. So it's not only surveillance cameras, but it's also like through everyone's phones as well. And you really experience what it's like to live in that kind of a world through the film itself, because his films always have a sort of what I would call a procedural moment. So if you get, to sort of use film language, right? The procedural is like Dragnet, like, where you get the facts of the case, the law and order, like this is what we're investigating. We're going to go out, and and everything proceeds step by step, towards the investigation, the apprehension, and the prosecution, right? That's the procedural is kind of the antithesis of noir, right? Which is all about fate, impossibility, indeterminacy, ambiguity, right? And what's interesting in Wild Goose Lake I think in Dow Yunan's other films, is there's always a procedural moment where you get this sort of like the possibility of like well-functioning surveillance, right? So like the police captain who's trying to investigate this, right? You have the sort of like debriefing, right, where we're given surveillance footage of the criminal, which actually was actual surveillance footage of the actual crime scene, right? So Dow Yan is incorporating the actual surveillance footage.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Fiction film.
Yeah.
But and he's using actual maps, actual regional maps.
Yeah, that I knew. Yeah, they were real maps of these these neighborhoods that are shifting, right? These neighborhoods that are changing because of rezoning and
Right, and the incredible urbanization of China that's growing so much. And so you have this procedural moment, but of course, as you watch the film, the procedural, the desire for a sort of procedural predictability breaks down, and that's when Noir takes over. And then Noir sort of shows the sort of the paranoia, the dystopia, the impossibility, the fate. I think in one of Dow Yunan's other films, there's a character who says like, is there any possibility outside of fate? And so that the shift, the breakdown of procedural into the impossibilities of Noir, where you end up by the water and most people are dead, right, is a sort of very bleak commentary upon like life, like the possibility of freedom in this kind of society.
And there's a kind of hybridity that you're talking about. I mean, it's also very much an art house and a genre picture, these incredible fight scenes, these incredible choreographed, fight scenes, which obviously really, come out of an Asian cinema tradition, as well. And a kind of, the hybridity of globalization and kind of, I mean, you were sort of alluding to then there's like what's happening in China, right? And the surveillance state and this idea of it, exploring it. And then, but then this is also, it may not be manifesting exactly the same way, right, as it is in China, but it's kind of a globalized experience. And there's kind of a hybridity in the different influences, the different film influences, the Asian cinema, the Western cinema. And it's all this kind of mixture that's coming together in this incredible, beautiful, beautiful stew that's just gorgeous to behold. I mean, visually, it's a really, really beautiful film. I don't think I've ever seen as much neon, except in Houston. I maybe think of Houston too. There's so much neon in Houston. Parallel.
I definitely think like, that sort of to get back to what you were saying about the sort of hybridity and the sort of like the multiple sort of cross-cultural sort of references or borrowings that are going on, right? Like, you can't, if being someone who knows Hong Kong cinema, right, you can't look at like all this neon in this film and just the way that the incredible palette that he and the cinematographer work through, right, where you have these whole scenes that happen in like, one, like about the background that I have here, right, of just like neon colors or like washed in these artificial, hyper-saturated artificial colors, right? I mean, you say, oh, that, he must, that looks so much like a Wong Kar-wai, Christopher Doyle film, right? Which is so, but that's, that's set in Hong Kong. And one of the things about contemporary China today, particularly the cities, Wuhan is China's biggest city, the biggest city in central China, right? I mean, like those cities, as we are finding out right now with the pandemic, right, are, at a very advanced state of modernity, right? And so they're living, I mean, they look like Blade Runner,
right,
which famously was Hong Kong on a bad day.
Right.
They are living that future in a way maybe even before we are.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, let's talk a little bit more about the aesthetics and the filmmaking. I mean, there's incredible reverse shots in the film that, again, I think kind of are more rooted in sort of Asian genre pictures, directed by people like John Woo. And like, that's, an interesting place where it's kind of maybe not coming from the Western tradition. And there's a lot of those, there's a lot of amazing like reverse shots in the film that are really interesting. And that scene with the newspapers where he's I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that, where he's pointing the gun at all the different newspaper clippings and the sound floods in that it like connects up to, I mean, each kind of, clipping, whether it's like a pop star or a wedding or whatever it is. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that in any movie.
I was thinking about that, but like, okay, so it doesn't happen in Taxi Driver when he's like,
oh,
doesn't it?
But does the sound is what is really
Yeah,
unique. His
so
use
the
of
sound,
sound in that scene, I've
right, the
never
sound is
seen
super interesting,
anybody
but
use sound. Yeah.
I feel like it happens in an Antonioni film.
With the sound in
Yeah,
that same way.
but like I
Yeah.
couldn't remember which one it was, or I could be
Okay.
making this up, or maybe in Chris Marker, but like, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
like there's like these, there are these auteur, there's definitely these sort of auteur moments that Zhao does, right, folded, as you're saying, into a genre piece or genre formula, which makes it simultaneously both incredibly, it makes it
Yeah. Super
accessible,
accessible.
also,
Yeah.
also just like, refreshing is a weird word to use for such a
Yeah.
and violent film, but certainly a new sensation for sure.
Well, can you talk a little bit about like, how stylized it is in the cinematography, and just let's get a little bit more into the aesthetics. We talked about some of the social context,
Yeah,
which is, pretty fascinating and
yeah,
incredible.
yeah,
And both so localized, right? And so globalized at the same time.
yeah,
But what about the cinematography and the very, very stylized aesthetic? And let's
yeah.
talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a beautiful, I mean, again, it seems strange to use these sort of, these adjectives of beautiful, ravishing, like, but I mean, in a way they are, like, there's the scene in the sort of shack where Hugo goes to repair his injury, and it's photographed, like, it just this incredibly painterly quality to
Mm,
the walls, to the surfaces. I mean, and first of all noir films, so many of them, they take place at night. It requires a certain kind of mastery of lighting and color, right,
mhm.
in order to communicate enough information when scenes are as dark as, like, say, for instance, the scene behind me, right. um, yeah, and then one of the things that what I really love about his work is what I would call this sort of like, um, the love of the outre. So,
Mhm.
like, there are these sort of moments all the time in his films where you get, like, what makes them memorable is like this thing that you don't expect. So early on, one of the very first fight scene you get in the film, when somebody's leg is broken, you also get somebody biting into a cucumber, right? And so there's, I mean, there's almost kind of like, absurdist kind of association going on there. And then of course, the scene in the zoo, right, the hunted and the
Mhm.
hunter, right, and these close-ups on the animals doing, whose faces can't possibly the faces of the animals can't possibly have any relationship, conscious relationship to the
Mhm.
protagonist, and yet, like, they're registering. Jiao uses these
Mhm.
faces of these, um, uses the animal faces to convey emotion, and then of course the music as well.
Mhm.
I mean, there's Zhao uses
Yeah, the music's incredible.
yeah, and not local, right? He like Wong Kar-wai reaches beyond like a sort of
Mhm.
Chinese musical idiom, right? And
Mhm.
uses a deliberately sort of world music mix,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
so in this film particularly, it's very percussive. So
Mhm.
he uses like this kind of percussive. I think he actually uses like some African music or something,
Mhm. Mhm.
you know but it works wonderfully, particularly in the fight scenes, right? Because, and he talks about this as he imagines himself as orchestrating it like Chinese opera, where
Mhm.
everything
Mm.
happens on a beat, everything happens,
Mm.
all the action has to be punctuated by sound,
Mm. Mm.
so he describes what he describes his sound mixing,
Mhm.
his orchestration, like, swordsman's films, right? Like a kung fu or a flying swordsman film
Mhm.
orchestrated, but the music that he's choosing is coming from sort of world music.
Yeah, yeah. And especially at the end, that kind of the rattling, the sort of the fences or what the railings in the apartment building where there's that chase at the end, the
Yeah,
way that percussive, the rattling kind of, that's so incredible. The
yeah,
percussion of that. Just yeah, and the absurdity when there's the shootout between the cops and the gangsters and they finish their dance with the neon
yeah,
sneakers.
yeah.
Like they're all having the shootout with the neon sneakers. I mean, that was very, yeah, there's a lot of humor and absurdity, right? I
Yeah,
mean, the gang leader, like the gang wasn't so great. They were like, "Can you show us how to shoot a gun?" Like, there's a lot of use
right.
of like humor, humor and absurdity also.
Right, right, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, and it's wonderful because he is like, they register as these kind of auteur signatures, right?
Yeah.
So I'm talking about them as these sort of things that Dao does all the time in his films that you don't really expect. They become these markers of like his world. But then at the same time, those sneakers, right? Like they're totally rooted within the world that he's portraying. And so like it's simultaneously a realistically grounded film that's profoundly local, right? The way that you're talking about, like the geography, the language, right? But then it's completely legible to an outsider.
Right, and the palette, the palette is so local, and that's why it was interesting about like Houston and that kind of local neon palette, which is a very specific thing. It doesn't, every place in the world doesn't have as much neon. It's like Wuhan and Houston,
Right.
So and just how those sneakers were a callback to all the other. Totally. All right, so woman to woman. So, and we're gonna take audience questions. Like, get ready, get your audience questions ready. So, like, woman to woman, shout out to the women characters in the movie. So, like, are those like, shout out to women characters. Are they like, I mean, is that like traditional to Chinese noir or like Hong Kong noir, the female characters, or what are your thoughts about, or is it like a departure? The representation of the women characters, like, or both, or let's talk about that a little.
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, like I was saying, I don't know how much we can really talk yet about a sort of a mainland Chinese noir. But I mean, I will say that like actresses,
or even Hong Kong too,
right. But actresses, and this is what makes mainland Chinese cinema, crime films like really interesting in comparison to Hong Kong. Like, the sort of seventh generation, the sixth and seventh generation filmmakers, they have really strong female characters. I mean, obviously the fifth generation did as well, but the sixth and seventh generation, which are talking about millennial China, like post market reform China, right? They have these female characters that a lot of times are sort of, I mean, they register the subjectivity of the nation in the same way that female characters did in the fifth generation. But the subjectivity of the nation now is one that's modern, that's capitalism with a Chinese face, that's urban, where it's fast-paced economy, where it's not simply the sort of the concubine or yellow earth that we got in the fifth generation. And these incredible actresses who execute them. And so this is one thing that Chinese cinema, to its credit, right, unlike some other cinemas where we don't, where actresses and female characters are often secondary, right? Jia Zhangke, Bigan, and Zhang Wen, and Dao Yinan, they find these actresses, like he used the actress in Wild Goose Lace. She's also she's the star in Black Hole, Thin Ice.
Can you talk about that a little bit? That film, you really like that film, right?
Oh yeah, that film.
His previous
great.
film, yeah.
So I mean, and that one, Diao won the Golden Bear, right, at Brooklyn.
Yes.
And I mean, after you see Wild Goose Lake, you should all go back and watch Black Hole, Thin Ice. I mean, they work really wonderfully as a pair. I mean, a lot of when Wild Goose Lake came out, everyone said that was his tropical noir, and that Black Hole, Thin Ice is a sort of winter noir, and that was when he sort of moved into a recognizable noir. The films before that were more character studies, and so. Black Coal, Thin Ice does it's very much the sort of same thing, and I think, and Jiao talks now about sort of being very comfortable in this genre, in this idiom, because it allows him to tell the stories that he wants, right? At the same time that it's allowed him, increasing commercial and critical access. So, I mean, Wild Goose Lake, what had both, however, you could look at it either like unfortunate or fortuitous timing because of it's being set in Wuhan, so it was made before the pandemic, that it comes out as the pandemic is beginning, right? So now all the theaters are shut, so now it has to be delivered through streaming, but everybody's interested, knows about Wuhan now in a way that they wouldn't have, the global audiences know about Wuhan now in a way they wouldn't have previously. Right. So, but Jiao, like, he's talking about he talks about noir now as a sort of language that's going to allow the film genre that allows him to tell these stories about sort of the contemporary China that he knows.
Mm-hmm. What about how the futuristic aesthetic is used in the service of this, kind of recent, this near history, if you will, this kind of crime story, and how that kind of then produces a kind of lore in the film? Could you talk a little bit about that, or your thoughts about that? And if you think that, what you think about that? I guess that's another kind of hybridity, this kind of futurist aesthetic and this kind of like going back to 2012.
You
Yeah.
mean like sort of like the prescience of the film, even though it's set in 2012, like the way it seems so relevant to this moment now?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think like to go back to like, so by setting it in 2012, he's saying that like this story is happening at the moment that Xi Jinping becomes president. Like,
And what is that about? Like, talk a little bit about that.
And so the thing is, we all know now in 2019, in 2020, that Xi Jinping has appointed himself sort of indefinite like administration, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so no term limits anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so the sort of the occasion that goes unsaid, but is that is implicit but not within the film, is this idea like what is the future of a nation, right? Which no longer has autonomy. It cannot change it if one person has indefinite authority over the country. I mean, like that's a pretty strong commentary upon fate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. That there is no that things are already decided. The future has already been decided indefinitely. There's no built-in change.
Mm.
And so paradoxically, by reaching back to the past of 2012, right, Dow is making comment upon the contemporary period, which is like the impossibility of a future, right, or the futility of a future where fate is already predetermined.
Mm. Do you think there's any connection between that and how interchangeable the cops and gangsters are in the film?
Oh yeah, and I mean, of course, that's that the interchangeability of cops and gangsters, right? Is
It's nothing new. I mean, yeah, it's
right.
not
I
a
mean,
new
it's
idea.
axiom of the procedural,
Yeah.
axiom of noir, right?
Yeah.
And it, the sort of implications of what the kinds of stories it tells, and what the artist, the filmmaker, uses it for, is always like what's interesting about that, right? And so, right, yeah. I mean, I think for Dow, right, like there's this incredible like empathy for class hopelessness, right? That that there's always a sort of suggestion that like everybody in this world that he's portraying could be one of these other people, right? Based on circumstance, right? Because all of them are people who are just trying to get by, and they're either like they're either forced to give up they're either forced to tell on their neighbor, to inform on their neighbor, right? To accidentally kill or maim or hurt somebody, to commit petty crimes, to be a prostitute, right? Any one of these sort of undesirable positions are forced upon people because of the really debased economic circumstances and limited opportunities that they find themselves in, right? I think Dow makes it very clear that he doesn't see that these are not necessarily moral choices that acting out of moral depravity, that all of these actions are sort of like paths of circumstance, right?
We have a question from, shout out to Marion Luntz, the head of the film program at the Museum of Fine Arts. And you are on the film committee, right? For the Museum of Fine Arts also. So Marion's question, which is a really good one, is how are his films received in China?
So that's a really great question. So he has steadily gotten more acclaim, and that's actually one thing that many times with these sort of like globally renowned Chinese filmmakers, there's a big split between their global recognition and their reputation at home. And then sort of, the big filmmakers in mainland China, like Fang or the guy behind the Wolf Warrior series, the big commercial successes are the ones that are doing state appropriate material, like either like flat out like mainstream melodies, like politically appropriate rhetoric or like material that's not politically controversial. So ones that give a sort of like glossy version of contemporary China, right? Now, what's been interesting recently is that there's been in the past 15 or 20 years, there's emerged in the 6th and 7th generation, this line of young filmmakers who are very good at sort of like towing the line and simultaneously sort of like portraying a more nuanced version of contemporary China that simultaneously is both, you know, interesting to global audiences and critics, but also like finds like some kind of outreach with local audiences at home, the more sophisticated and perhaps challenging viewers at home. So what, particularly after Dao won the Golden Bear, he had more interest back in China. And Wild Goose Lake, in its very short commercial run in the theaters before it had to close down because of the pandemic, had already earned 27 million US. So it's already done quite well commercially. And then, I don't know, it's still streaming online. So the box office is not done both.
Wait, how much did you say?
27 million.
Wild Goose Lake?
Yeah.
That was globally? Just in the US?
You know, I thought it was, but okay. Yeah, it was global, right? But
yeah. Still, that's great.
That's a lot for a Chinese film.
That really says a lot about the appetite for this kind of art house genre, international kind of think piece, auteur fare, right? That maybe is part of this kind of larger Parasite moment, perhaps, right? Yeah. That is really emerging and
Yeah, it was like, I think it was like in the 1 month that it was available in the theaters in China, it was one of the top grossing films for that within December. And it obviously has these sort of interesting parallels and differences from Parasite. So Parasite has just broken, you know, local, like in South Korea and global box office records for sort of foreign language film, right? And Parasite is, you know, such an accessible movie, you know, not because of its genre, which is kind of sui generis and unto itself, right? But because Parasite strikes a chord with everybody at this moment of sort of global wealth inequity, of financial and environmental precariousness, right? Of mass class unrest, right? Parasite is speaking to a lot of people all over the world, right? Wild Goose Lake, you know, it's not as sort of the sui generis is the word that I used earlier to talk about Parasite. Like Wild Goose Lake, as we've been saying, sort of works within a recognizable genre, right? It's working within the idiom of noir. It's profoundly regional and local. At the same time, it's legible globally. And so if in a way, Parasite is a kind of universal story that happens to be set in South Korea, but could be set anywhere in the world. And of course, Parasite's being, you know, adapted by Hollywood right now, right?
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it is. As you know, as any successful Asian film, inevitably nowadays is adapted by Hollywood.
But everybody's seen it on Hulu, so whatever. It's on Hulu right now.
Wild Goose Lake is like, you know, Parasite is this thing that happened in South Korea that like is completely legible anywhere else in the world because it's a universal story. Wild Goose Lake is like this funny sort of like feedback, the product of feedback, right? Where Chinese language, while Jiao Yinan, you know, from his position in China, having gone to film school in China and raised by parents who worked in the Chinese film industry, has like been nursed on world film, you know, absorbed all of it and is spitting it back out through this like very, you know, unique idiosyncratic virtuoso look that managed to be both simultaneously, you know, intentionally local and national and distinct, but also still accessible by global audiences.
So we have a question from a couple of members of our audience, both Michael and Brian, which is an interesting question, are wondering what your thoughts are on how the depiction, exploration of the surveillance state would be different if it were set now in 2019 with social media where it's at, you know, 7 years after the film is set, and how
like
things might be different.
The same film in China, but
and set right now, like 2018, 2019, 2020, you know.
well, the cell phones would be completely different, and all the
Yeah.
surveillance would happen through cell phones. So if you've seen, if anyone's seen the original of The Departed, Infernal Affairs, which is a Hong
Yes.
Kong film, right? So like it all depends on cell phones, and so like
Which is it was quite superior to The Departed, as I've said to you
right?
before.
You know, and
Definitely
so
see Infernal Affairs. Shout out to that movie. It's the best.
right, and then
Yeah.
and again, many people in the West don't recognize this, but like, Asia has like much higher, deeper rates of cell phone technology, cell phone usage, technology. They're early adapters, much more so than the West. We tend to get cell phone technologies a little bit later. And then because of the different kinds of legal and state systems in Asia, there is much more advanced and pervasive surveillance technology and surveillance practice that's possible through the cell phone, through telecommunications. And of course, so China has been at the leading edge of this. So, in the world of 2012 that Wild Goose Lake portrays, the surveillance, as I said earlier, is primarily, it's really through it's photographic, through surveillance cameras, footage, and through still pictures, right? And even like organic through informants, neighborhood informants, right? But nowadays, Chinese surveillance is entirely digital. It happens through cell phones. And so in China, everybody has to join all of these. There's all these apps that like you can't function in China without having these apps, like, social media apps that are also tied to banking, that are also tied to state regulations about your employment and your residency, which gives the state like massive control and knowledge about every one of its residents and citizens. Of course, and this is, since the pandemic, this has been augmented, many times more so, for issues of contact tracing as well.
Right. This is the vehicle for contact tracing, right? And this is something that inevitably probably will become globalized.
Right.
These methods will be.
Right. Goes to my point always about, if you really want to understand the future, the global futures, and particularly global surveillance futures, we should always look towards Asia.
Wow. Okay, another like filmy question. This is from Judy. Do you have any thoughts on the meaning of the white hat sinking into the sea? If you think there's any symbolism there?
Well, I mean, I think it's a lot of different things, right? I mean, the white hats are obviously hats that the bathing beauties wear. It's a sign of their profession, right? The hat is so like, to me, the hat as a sort of, I mean, this is a factual thing. This is what these women wear to signal what they're doing, right? There's something really, the hat in itself is such a sad thing, right? Because it's a sign of the kind of profession that they're reduced to, right? You're supposed to be wearing these hats because you want to, women will wear wide brimmed hats by the sea because they want to keep the sun off their faces. But of course, these are women who they're not able to live a life of leisure, right? Like they have to work in those most debased circumstances. And then of course, white should be innocence, which is particularly ironic given their profession, right? And then, and noir, in general, in art in general, particularly in noir, right? The white is, and then the sinking of the whiteness, right, is again a sort of reminder of innocence lost, of the futility and the impossibility of purity, right? All of those themes that the film is suggesting.
So I think we're going to wrap up shortly, but I guess, want to just ask you for any kind of, wait, we have one more question coming in. Let's see. Just if you could talk, and then I'm going to ask you a final question. If you could speak a little bit about the distinction between the like rural town location and kind of, versus the, Wuhan, the urban city, the rural location where the behavior is seen as more insidious versus, the urban, Wuhan, where it's more kind of normalized. And how the concept of surveillance applies to the less crowded areas. If you could answer that.
Yeah, so, in China, there's been this massive transformative economic change, which has lifted, millions of people into the into the middle class, but that's really been experienced by people in the urban center, in the big cities, the urban and industrial centers, and then the rural parts have really been sort of excluded from that, and they still subsist in very sort of very marginal subsistence economic lives. And so Wuhan is particularly important for sort of registering this kind of uneven development that's happening nationally, because Wuhan is very close to the Three Gorges Dam, which is one of the first massive infrastructure projects that China did towards the end of the 20th century to sort of signify their prosperity and their aspirations. So in order to start the Three Gorges Dam, like China was just like raising massive like swaths of the nation, causing huge amount of displacement, completely changing its environment. And so Wuhan was already the biggest city, but it's a city that was like riven by these economic and geographical or territorial or physical transformations. And so what happens, I think, a lot of times, and this is, again, a sort of lesson that the film has for everyone in the world, right? I think in the world that we live in now, right, is when people get left behind in economic change, right, that produces it fosters prejudice and unrest, suspicion, and unrest, right? And so when the police captain talks about these unruly populations on the outside, he doesn't really provide any evidence for that. It's a kind of prejudice, a kind of stereotyping that he's making about a population that perhaps out of no fault of their own have been left behind, right? And then so I think like that's again a sort of urban experience that's true of Wuhan, as it is throughout many parts of China, as it is throughout many parts of the developing world, right? You know, that the filmmaker Diao Yinan portrays with a great deal of sympathy, and he sort of suggesting the sort of sociological origins for the kinds of crimes that Noir portrays.
And is the scene with the small business owners that are like in that basement meeting having a lottery about their rezoned businesses where the bathing beauty is raped, is that a kind of comment on that?
It's as well that like everybody's forced into these circumstances, and you know, like that they're all just trying to get by, and sometimes they have to make choices of which they're not proud, right? And that would, but for the grace of God, that could be one of us. And
and is this movie state approved in China, or I didn't catch that when you were talking about that earlier, how it's received in China?
Yeah, well, it would have had to have been.
It would have had to have been to play there.
Yeah.
And that would have been the 27 million. Okay, well, I guess like, yeah, so the closing question is just, you know, what else do you want, when we think about the sound design, the cinematography, the, subtext of the film, and, closing, what else do you want us to think about, as when we think about this film?
I think one of the things that, I don't know if this is like the one thing that I would emphasize above all else, but it's one thing that we haven't talked about so far, and one thing that I really appreciate about Diao as a filmmaker is that I really feel that he's an actor's director, even though even though he started as a screenwriter, perhaps because he started as a screenwriter, is that he's very comfortable like allowing his actors to have to find their way through the story themselves. And so if you think about, as you're watching the movie, like how long and we talked about this too with the shot reverse shot and like the sort of compositions that he chooses, that how long he's willing to let the camera rest on faces without any dialogue, right? How often characters interact with each other without dialogue. If you think about like one of the earlier noodle scenes that happened in the film is when the man and the woman reconnect after he's injured and he's starving, and they happen to reconnect there in this noodle shop, and the proprietor wants them to order noodles, and there's several glances go back and forth between them in shot reverse shot without any language, or the only language that's uttered is her to the proprietor of the noodle shop, not between the man and the woman. And
yes,
so I really appreciate like that kind of mastery of story that tells the story through glances and through expression rather than language, and the kind of trust that if a director has with his actors to do that as well.
Yeah, and when they're in is that a train station or an airport earlier in the film when they also order food and or beers and she's the only one that communicates?
I think that's a train station.
That was a train station, okay. Are there other films that, if we like Wild Goose Lake, that you would recommend?
Well, I mean, you should definitely see Long Day's Journey Night, the Begun film from a couple years ago, which is the same cinematographer, which is the same sort of these very fatalistic, indeterminate plot of people pursuing sort of like persisting under sort of relentless and brutal circumstances to sort of on a kind of personal journey. I would definitely see that. I mean, Jia Zhangke, the sort of, venerable, reigning sort of sixth generation filmmaker of contemporary China, who's very good from whom Diao learned a great deal. I would watch, Jia Zhangke's films. Zhang Wen, the actor turned director, who Diao worked with in Shower, for which he was screenwriter. Zhang Wen is very interesting, such an important person in contemporary Chinese film. I would watch that. I would also watch Johnny To, the Hong Kong filmmaker, who very recently, who started to make films in China as well. And Johnny, I feel like Diao is also sort of learning from Johnny To's sort of interest in the sort of groupthink of criminals and the way the way the criminal underworld can be used as a paradigm for society at large.
Well, talking to you, Ms. Karen Fang, has been, the cherry on top to watching this incredible film. This has been an amazing discussion, and I know I've learned a lot. And it just, really just kind of put everything into focus around. Is a really great film. I really enjoyed this film. I thought it was quite beautiful. And we're so glad that you were able to talk to us. Thank you so much. And we're so glad that everybody was able to join us. And thank you to the HAAPI Film Festival again, and to the Asian Society Texas Center for partnering with us on this week-long theatrical run of Wild Goose Lake. And again, thank you so much, Karen Fang, for this incredible conversation and just really putting a lot of everything into context and focus. And this has just been great. The Houston Cinema Art Society is going to continue our digital programming. Wednesday, we are doing an online program of The River and the Wall. This is a free program, and it's in honor of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Shout out to the Earth. Yay, Earth Day. Yay, planet Earth. And that's going to be followed by a discussion with the producer, Emmy award-winning producer, Hilary Pierce, of The River and the Wall. And it's an incredible documentary about the area around the Rio Grande and the Rio Grande River and the wall that is in the process of being built there. All of this is on our website, cinemahtx.org. And then we also start another theatrical run on Friday of this film, Pahoke, which is an incredible film, another nonfiction film about a group of high schoolers in Florida, a really powerful film that was quite the toast of Sundance. And we're also gonna be doing a Q&A with the directors. That's gonna be coming up about mid next week. Everything will be on our website, cinemahtx.org. And we're gonna be doing a lot of other programming, film-related, theater-related, music-related, art-related. So please check back in. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our partners, and everybody out there, be safe, be well. And thank you again, Karen, so much for this. This was really, really a treat. What a great way to end a Sunday evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Take care, everybody. Bye. Thank you.